Well, dear friends, today we will take a look into those areas that many of us have been thinking, if COVID is a big lie, maybe some of the other things that the same people who brought us COVID and told us about, maybe some of the other things are also not really true. And that is the first step to making use of your own brain again, of your own reasoning again, like Kant many years ago said when he said sapere aude, which means dare use your own reasoning, dare use your own brain. So that's why we will now talk with Andrew Johnson from the United Kingdom, from England. He will talk to us about 9/11, of course, which many people think must have happened in a different way than what we saw on television. But also, we will take a closer look into UFOs. And then, of course, we will see the parallels between these issues and COVID-19, the corona pandemic. Hi, Andrew. It's great to have you here. I have been waiting for this, and I'm very happy and grateful to Paul for having arranged this. But of course, I'm honored to have you here, and I can't wait to hear you talk about these things. Who are you? What is your background? I know I've read up on you, but I know that on Wikipedia you can't believe anything. So I will leave it to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Reiner. It's a very great pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you. And thanks for all the work you did with the Corona Committee and all the other work you've been doing here as well. It's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
And it's great to be, speaking to like-minded people who have, started to peel back these layers of that have been covering up what you might call a realer reality or something like that, or an expanded reality. So to talk about myself, well, I'm a pretty ordinary guy, really. I was born in a place called Keighley in Yorkshire, and I grew up in a town called Skipton. And I went to what they call a grammar school here. And the school that I went to was called Ermysted's Grammar School, and it was founded in 1492. So it had some tradition behind it. And so I went to university. I did a degree in computer science and physics. So I know I'm fairly competent with physics, which has been very useful. I studied sciences, maths, physics, chemistry, biology for what we call A-level in this country. And then I went to work for an engineering company, essentially. It's called General Electric Corporation. I worked for GEC Electrical Projects in a place called Rugby, which was where the game rugby was invented. And I started working in microelectronics software. So I was writing software which drove small devices which were used in factories for process control. And there were some programmable logic controllers that this GEC used to sell, and I wrote a bit of software for those and various others. Then I went to work in telecommunications software. I worked on software which was used in what's called a PABX, Private Automatic Branch Exchange. And then I went to work on what was called an ISDN terminal, which was like an early form of smartphone, really, a very early form of smartphone. That was in the early 90s. Had a few trips to the US. We did some testing with Southwestern Bell in St. Louis. And then I went to the US 3 times. I went to Chicago and stuff. So that gave me a bit of a flavor for international travel. I'm from a working class background, essentially. I don't, my parents didn't have a lot of money, and my father was an orphan when he was 14, and he was actually, my dad, I've recently found out, was part of Operation Fork, which was this operation where they sent a small group from the UK up to Iceland to see if the Nazis had made a base on Iceland. They hadn't at that time, but he went on that boat in 1941 or 2. I didn't know that until about 10 years ago. So, just sort of ordinary background, really. I'm a youngest of 9 children, all of that stuff. So really going from there, it was, I developed an interest in computing, and that's why I did the degree, and blah, blah, blah. I'm going backwards and forwards a little bit. And then eventually, I suppose we get to when I was setting up my first website in the early 90s. I'd set up my first website in 1996. And then when we got broadband in 2003 here, I started logging on and finding that I could access all this information. Watched a documentary on TV called Britain's Closest Encounter, which was about the so-called Rendlesham Forest incident, where an object landed in Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, which is about 100 miles from where I live now. I actually went there about 5 years ago to see this, the site of this. They've got a trail there. And so that got me interested in the UFO issue, which we'll maybe come back to later. I think you want to talk about that. And that's become more relevant actually in the last few weeks for what's been put in the headlines. And I thought, what's all this about then? This and I up until then, I thought I wasn't going to find out much. But then I found this thing called the Disclosure Project, which was run by this chap called Stephen Greer, and I went really deeply down that rabbit hole. I was down that rabbit hole for at least a year. I established contact with various people, one of whom I think turned out to be, at least one of them, turned out to be somebody who worked for the UK intelligence services. I didn't realise that at the time, but I'm pretty sure he did from various things that he said to me and got involved with. And I got a lot of contacts through that. People were coming to me asking me about UFOs, asking me to do talks. So I started doing talks about UFOs and aliens and stuff like that, based on this Disclosure Project material, which is very interesting. Then, as I said, I started to look at other stuff, and I found out about, I came across some discussion of 9/11 and what really happened, and I came across this concept of state-sponsored terrorism, and I'd never heard of this. And then I started to explore this area where, clandestine groups within governments would, for example, fund groups like Al-Qaeda or these fundamentalist groups like the Taliban or whatever, and there would be some back door where they'd get arms shipped to them, and then they would go and blow something up. But really, it wasn't Al-Qaeda blowing things up. Really, it was the CIA, or it was the Russian equivalent, or it was the Israelis or something, whoever was behind it. And so they put out a story, they put out a narrative, they get that out within the first 24 hours. This is what happened, folks. This is what happened, honest. Here's an expert to tell you that this is what happened. He's a top expert on this, so you can't really challenge his opinion. So don't, just believe it, swallow it, and that's the truth. And just don't look for yourself. Get on with it. Nothing else to see. Just go on, believe this, and be afraid. That was the basic. That's a basic method, isn't it? Broken down to its simplest form.
Absolutely. I can see the parallels with COVID-19 already.
Yeah. So, like I said to you just before we started recording, I saw the disappearance of the towers and I was absolutely scared out of my wits. I thought there was going to be another war, and I didn't think about it for 18 months until, like I say, I found this thing about state-sponsored terrorism. Then I watched this documentary, which was called 9/11: The Great Illusion, made by a Texan called George Humphrey. And within that documentary, there's a lot of stuff which isn't specifically about what happened on 9/11, but the thing that really stood out for me was a bit of physics, essentially, because I mentioned the physics that I talked about earlier on. And what they showed in this video, which I hadn't realized or hadn't remembered up until that point, and this is the key point, that the towers disappeared at a rate of free fall. And I looked at this and I watched the videos and I measured the time, and it was like 9 seconds. So if you were to go from the top of the tower, which was 1,360 feet high, to the bottom, this took less than 10 seconds. This was impossible because if you do the calculation with S equals ut plus a half at squared, which is one of the equations of motion, and you put in the figures, u is 0 because that's the official velocity, so the first term reduces to 0. Acceleration due to gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared, and then you put in the 9-second figure, and you put in the distance, etc. It came down at free fall rate. I actually learned later that it didn't come down, it didn't collapse. People say the towers collapsed, no, they didn't collapse. As I later discovered, and we'll get onto that shortly, they turned to dust in midair. And what I can do is I've got some slides here. If you want me to share those, I can show you some of these.
So, yes, I would very much love to see those slides.
Okay, so I've got some slides here. So if you want to, I think you have to approve that end, don't you? But we can go to that there.
Here we go. It's coming up.
And so there you are. So that's one of my initial slides with a summary of some of the things We'll get to the hurricane as well at some point, which almost nobody knows about. And then people can get my books from the website for free. All my books are available for free.
Wow.
And there's 7 of them. Let's see. So we can go to, for example, just let's have a look at this one. Now in this picture, this is kind of mirrors what happened to me and to many of us. If you look at this picture, you might look there and see, well, is it a real picture? Is it CGI? Is it a painting? But then if you look, you find out there's more information in that picture than you realize, because there's actually a picture of a baby in there, a sort of fetal baby. And if you look there in the lower right, you can see this outline of the baby with its feet over towards the right and its head.
Oh, yeah.
So this is really an analogy for what we've all gone through, and we've seen that there's other things going on which we didn't initially see. So that was just a quick sort of, version of seeing that. So then let's go back to the towers, and as Dr. Judy Wood explained later on, we'll just do this now so that we've got it out of the way. The towers didn't collapse. They turned mostly to dust in midair. In fact, you can see that on the left picture there, you mentioned the Deutsche Bank, Rainer, and you see the Deutsche Bank building there, which was a 47-story building. So that's a 40-story building. So what we've got there in that group of material there, the Dr. Judy Wood has called this a snowball. You've got 70 stories of building. How is this possible? 70 stories of building all within that, because you've still got the lower 40 stories which haven't disappeared yet. So do you think there's 70 stories of building all in that snowball? You have to answer that question for yourself. I don't think there is. No. And then we see this mid-destruction. We see this it's like this material is coming up. It's coming up out of the building. This is almost like a drinking fountain. So just to I'll try and go back to one other slide now. I'm going to skip around slightly, but let's just see where we get to. Yeah. So to try and sort of summarize this, the official story was that planes crashed into the World Trade Center towers, and there was a fire. The fire was so bad that the steel heated up, melted, and then the buildings fell down. When you start reading about state-sponsored terrorism, it's a short jump then to say, well, what actually happened was on 9/11 was a form of covert terrorism, and in fact the buildings were wired up with bombs, and they were destroyed with bombs, and the bombs cut the building up into chunks, and the buildings fell down. But that didn't happen either. The buildings actually turned mostly to dust in midair before they hit the ground. Okay, that's actually what happened. And so I was drawn into this truth movement, or whatever you want to call it. And I then I started posting. I mentioned the physics, so I started posting on a physics forum, and I said, look, let's just go to this as well. I can show you this slide as well, which was the basis of what I posted on the physics forum, if I can find it. So let's just go to this one. Yeah. So again, very briefly, so that we've got know what we're talking about, we can see here, this essentially proves the disappearance of the towers. And this proves some of what the truth movement has said is also not true. Dr. Judy Wood, she talked about this picture for many years. We can see in the background here, World Trade Center number 7, not where that purple thing is, but behind it. So in the background, you've got World Trade Center number 7 in the dust cloud. That was destroyed at 5:20 in the evening. So we know that this picture was taken before 5:20 in the evening. It was probably taken about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, judging by the shadows, maybe even noon. We can see a firefighter there in the middle distance. We've got, I think it's World Trade Center number 4 in the background, and that's an 8-story building. So we know that there was nothing left of 2 of the towers at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So we can see the missing material, the amount that must be accounted for by looking at the picture in the right.
Yeah.
That's all the material that was AWOL between 10 o'clock in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
So all these stories about the steel being shipped to China and the building being blown up and cut into chunks, none of those stories are true. And the Al-Qaeda story, that can't be true either. So these two pictures and several like them that Dr. Judy Wood showed us all, they prove that none of those stories can be true. And there's other evidence too. So we've got to then I've got to sort of go back to how so here we go. Look, so taking a step sort of backwards and forwards and sideways, the official story says that the planes crashed, caused a pancake collapse, which was caused by melting of the steel. And this is an example from the BBC website. I think it's still there. If you were to click that link, you would see that story is still there. And it says fire reaches 800 degrees centigrade, hot enough to melt steel floor supports. That's not true, because steel doesn't melt until I think 1500 centigrade. So that's not true either on the BBC website. Still haven't corrected it, but we know that doesn't matter because the buildings turn to dust. So let's go to the next.
And we might want to add something to this. Dr. Judy Wood is an expert in materials sciences.
Correct. Correct. And there's much to tell about Dr. Judy Wood herself. But I'm skipping around a little bit here, but hopefully not too much.
Yeah, please do. This is so interesting, Andrew. This is great.
Thank you. So this is the equations of motion that I spoke about. So any physicist, anyone that's done high school physics up to the top level of high school should know this. Easily verifiable by watching the videos that are still available on any of the documentaries that all the disinformation organizations presented. And I posted this on a physics forum. I'd got to that point. So I posted this on a physics forum and said, what's wrong with this, please? Tell me. And that thread on the physics forum, I think, drew 4,000 responses, something like that. And then I got invited soon after that. I think the two are related, but I can't prove it. I got invited to join the Scholars for 9/11 Truth. The thing I didn't say earlier on is, following my development work in software development, as I say, I ended up working in education. I currently work for the Open University in the UK as a tutor in technology subjects, and I still work for them. I've worked for them for 20 years now. And the Open University actually published one of my articles about 9/11 way back in 2007. And that was just around the time I got in touch with Dr. Judy Wood. So because I was a tutor in the Open University, I got invited to join the Scholars for 9/11 Truth group by a chap called Stephen E. Jones, who's on the top right here, and Jim Fetzer, who is still, both these guys are still knocking around. I got an email from Stephen E. Jones saying, oh, please add Andrew to the forum, the Scholars for 9/11 Truth forum, and that was December 2005 that came in. And I thought, oh, great, there's some academics who are actually going to do something about 9/11. This is brilliant, and they started writing press releases, and I thought, great. And then Stephen E. Jones, he came along and he wrote this paper, Why Did the World Trade Center Towers Collapse? And I thought, oh, this is great, And he then started talking about not so much bombs in the building, but he said that thermite had been planted in the towers. And he said that, I think if it's on the next slide, let me just check. He said that he knew it was thermite or he suspected it was thermite because he had found this video which showed the thermite reacting. I haven't got that here. I might have it later in the presentation. So Jones was this physicist. I thought, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's a PhD in physics. It must be thermite. So he has a very small thumbnail, but why indeed did the World Trade Center buildings collapse? That was his paper. And he sent it round for review. We all did the peer review thing, and I read it, and I thought it was legitimate. And then I noticed that there was somebody else involved in this group called Dr. Judy Wood. And actually, Stephen E. Jones, he did this presentation, I think, in 2006, and he named an engineer at Clemson, a female engineer, but he didn't give her full name. And he read out a couple of the emails. And essentially that allowed somebody else to identify Dr. Wood who didn't want to be identified at that time. So he essentially disclosed her identity indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
Then Morgan Reynolds, who worked for the George Bush administration for 16 months as an economist, he got together with Dr. Wood in the Scholars for 9/11 Truth group, and they wrote an article, which is still on Dr. Wood's website, I think, in 2006. And in that article, they named me. They put my name in it because I was the person who'd edited together a video for Stephen E. Jones to show this thermite reaction. Let's just see if I can find that there again. Should be here somewhere. Is it? Because this is very. Here we go. So this was essentially part of the video that I was asked to edit by Jones. He had two clips of this alleged thermite reaction from the towers. On the left, you see this material dripping down, and this is the one that's done for a program called Brainiac, a TV program. That was a thermite reaction they set up because it looks very spectacular, you know, to people. They think, wow, that's mega, you know. And that's what I did. I edited this video together for Jones. So Wood and Reynolds named me in this article because they asked Jones, who had edited this video for them, and he told Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Wood that I'd done it. And I wrote to Morgan Reynolds and I said, oh yeah, that was me actually. I did do it, yep, you know. And I didn't really realize at the time, because I was just trying to be helpful, but I'd been used, and this is the key point, to put out disinformation, because it wasn't a thermite reaction that destroyed the towers. There may have been some sort of thermite reaction, but that certainly wasn't what destroyed the towers. No way. And you can see this because if you take this small amount of thermite on the right, which is like a flower pot full, you know, like, I don't know, a few hundred grams, that creates all of that, you scale that up to destroy the towers, and everyone in New York City would have been completely blinded and burned by this amount of thermite. So it became increasingly obvious that what Stephen E. Jones was proposing, that the World Trade Center towers were destroyed with thermite, was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. And I kicked myself. I was fooled once by the official story, and then I was fooled twice by this Jones character. And so that's when I started to realize that Dr. Judy Wood was basically looking at the evidence. And so at that point, she didn't say what the causative mechanism was. Okay, she didn't say. She just said, look, she was getting out pictures like this. Look, saying, this is what happened. You can see what happened in this picture. I don't know exactly what caused it yet, but I want to first find out what happened. And I think, Ryan, you watched the global BEM presentation from 2012. I understand through Elsie, you watched Dr. Judy Wood's 2-hour presentation, which was done in 2012. That's 11 years ago now. That's how long we've been banging on about this. But this picture is very revealing. You can look at World Trade Center number 5 there. Most of that is missing in the center of it. 7 is gone. 1 and 2 completely gone. 1, 2, and 3. World Trade Center number 3 is gone. And then I think you can't see World Trade Center number 4 because that's behind this. Bankers Trust got damaged. There's a whole story behind the Bankers Trust building after 9/11.
I need to hear that because it's Deutsche Bank, really. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, Deutsche Bank building. So I can tell you about that as well. I've got some slides about that here actually. And so Dr. Judy Wood was saying, look, this is what happened, folks. This is what happened. Look at what happened. And most of the 9/11 truth movement just said, oh yeah, it was thermite, or it was bombs, or it was nukes. They weren't actually explaining, for example, the wider effects of what a nuclear bomb would be, which would be the whole area would be irradiated. Nuclear bombs are extremely hot. So people wouldn't be, for example, see if I've got another slide here, I need to get to the one which is, I've got it here. Have I got it here? I may not have it here because I've got different versions of this presentation, and I've got some. Oh well, this will do just about, I think. So, for example, we have this slide that Dr. Judy Wood presented to us. We can see this ambulance in the foreground. How is that there? Why doesn't it have 100 stories of building on top of it? Why isn't it crushed with the doors half hanging off? But somewhere in this area actually is another related piece of evidence, which is Stairwell B. There was a documentary produced by Channel 4 in the UK called The Miracle of Stairwell B. 14 firefighters survived in Stairwell B, and one of them was J. Jonas, the other was Mickey Cross. Mickey Cross says he was they were coming down the stairs with a few people, they were helping them get out of the building, and they could feel the building coming apart. Mickey Cross says he tried to climb inside his helmet. He's pulling his helmet onto his head because his helmet is lifting off his head. He's pulling it down onto his head. And then he looks up a couple of minutes later, he's looking at blue sky. Yet they're only about 5-6 stories from the ground. That means 100 stories of building have disappeared above them.
Wow.
How can this happen? You know, they're just, and they walked out. 14 firefighters walked out of Stairwell B alive. Why weren't they buried under 100 stories of building? Or even 200 stories of building if you've got the 2 towers. So that right there shows you what happened. Those buildings disappeared. And then people will start to say to us, well, yeah, they did disappear, Andrew, but what happened was they fell into the basements. Many people will remember that there was a giant shopping mall under the World Trade Center. And there were 9 stories beneath the World Trade Center, some of which was a shopping mall, some of which was a car park. Well, this is a picture from that area, and if you look carefully, as Dr. Judy Wood pointed out to us, there is some water in the bottom here, and the 2 guys walking around, they're not buried under debris. In fact, that's pretty much a void. There's another guy here on a beam as well.
Yeah.
And these are some more guys looking around. And one of these pictures, it's not this one, there are 2 or 3 others at least. You can actually see the names on some of the mall stores, the banners, the shop banners at the front, not on this one. And there's some Warner Brothers figures from the Warner Brothers shop, Bugs Bunny and that. They were taken out and put in a museum. They were under the World Trade Center. So the debris didn't go into the basements, it's not there. And it didn't blow out around the place, it's not there. So where did it go? The answer is it turned to dust before it hit the ground. Again, I've got a video, but it doesn't always play well in Zoom, so I'll just see if it'll go. I'll go back to that video again. This doesn't matter too much. I'll try and play this video, but it doesn't always work here. Let's just see. We'll play this one anyway. So this is just a sequence of shots. This is from the so-called Spire. This will play twice. There are a number of videos of this. I think there's about 6 different videos from different angles. This is 70 stories of steel disappearing into dust in about 7 seconds. See, I'll try and play this video clip one more time, but I don't think it's going to play, does it? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Maybe it will play. And you can actually see some of these steel girders turning to dust. This one here particularly, it turns to dust before it hits. It's falling and turning to dust. It's falling and turning to dust. And here's the video that, which is the same as what I showed you in the stills. And so once you see this and know it and understand it, you're in a different place. You're in a different world. You're just in a completely different world, because what is being demonstrated here is a technology. A technology is being used here, and this is the technology that the 9/11 Truth Movement was set up to cover up. The 9/11 Truth Movement is, and that's a very broad brush statement, I know, but by and large, the 9/11 Truth Movement did not want to talk about Dr. Judy Wood. They didn't want to talk about the towers turning to dust. And in fact, I later found out that Stephen E. Jones didn't even want to talk about the free fall time of the towers. He didn't want to talk about that, which for a physicist I thought was pretty weird, because that was the first thing I picked up on as somebody who had a decent knowledge of physics. So anyway, what I've essentially done by going backwards and forwards a bit is I've tried to explain that I got involved with a group called Scholars for 9/11 Truth that was being used to put out disinformation. And let's see, I've got some stuff I don't really need to talk about there. And so there were 2 prongs to this, really. the scholars group, they wanted to talk about bombs in the building. They wanted to talk about thermite. They wanted to talk about, share dealings and things like that, and Al-Qaeda and intelligence failings. What Dr. Morgan Reynolds wanted to talk about was the lack of plane crashes. And again, do I need this slide again? Oh, here we go. So this one. So you can see here, for example, in the red square, there is a human figure.
Yeah.
That lady is called Edna Sintron. Sadly, she did not survive the destruction of the towers, but it was later revealed that that lady's name was Edna Sintron. So you can see that this alleged plane-shaped hole. Yeah. However, we have a problem with this concept because, as you know, as everyone should know, that planes have to be fairly flimsy, really, because if they're highly armored, they won't fly. They'll be too heavy. So you've got the situation here where wings, which are made of aluminium primarily, maybe a little bit of titanium for the wing struts and things, but fairly thin rods, have managed to somehow cut through aluminium on the outside and steel girders on the inside. And if you watch the videos and ask this question, can you see a plane inside there?
No, not a trace.
Not a trace. Not a wheel, not a wing strut, not a case, not a bit of luggage. There were some engines found, or an engine, I should say, which was from the wrong sort of plane, and it was found under some scaffolding. Not sure if I've got that on the next slide. I think I've got it around here somewhere.
From the wrong plane, even.
I believe so. But the plane stories themselves from the World Trade Center are very unusual. Now, in 2006, 500 accounts were published under a Freedom of Information request. And I went through these with a keyword search. I downloaded all 500 reports onto my computer, converted them to text, because that's what I do. I do a lot of data conversion and stuff like that. So I did that in about 5 minutes. And then I went through them all with a keyword search, a grep program. And after studying those files for a week or so, I was able to establish that only 20% of witnesses saw Flight 175. And these are people who were already there on the site, trying to pull people out from the destruction of the first building. Because we had the destruction of the first building, that was obviously a complete surprise. Then we had the second crash and people were already there. That was Flight 175. And only 20% of these people that were I was only able to establish were near, within half a mile. Only 20% of them saw the plane, and only 21% heard it. And only 8.3% of 117 people, that is, saw and heard the second plane. And we have people that were stood next to each other. For example, here, Scott Holowach, I don't know how to pronounce his name. At that time, Chief Ganshi was behind me, and he thought there was another explosion in the North Tower. And that's when I turned around and I said, "Chief, listen, there is a second plane." He was like, no, we have another explosion. I said, "No, Chief, I witnessed it. I watched the plane hit the other tower." He was like, "Are you sure?" I said, "Chief, I'm 100% positive. I watched the second plane hit the South Tower, the other tower." And then David Sandvik, we start heading down the block. We get down to, I guess, about Church Street, and the second plane hit. And I remember being underneath. I never heard the motor of the plane, the sound of the engines. We just saw the explosion. You felt the explosion. And looking up, and seeing that fire you see on the news, we're underneath it, looking up. Very unusual. And there's several accounts where they said, "I didn't know planes were involved until I saw it on the news the next day." And these were the first responders that were there. So we've got Morgan Reynolds saying no plane crashes at the World Trade Center. And we've got the Dr. Judy Wood saying, look, it wasn't bombs, it wasn't Al-Qaeda, the buildings turned to dust in midair. And so really, when you start to look at it, they were saying, look, Morgan Reynolds, Dr. Judy Wood, they're bringing the truth movement into disrepute, kick them out of the scholars group. So they kicked them out, and that's when they wrote the article showing you some of the things that I've mentioned here and more. But if there were no planes, real plane crashes, we can get onto what they probably were. But if there were no physical planes and the flight stories were somehow, again, rigged, like a lot of the stories of the coronavirus victims were somehow rigged up in some way. It explained the stories on the BBC, which came out a week or two after 9/11, 3 weeks after 9/11, actually, no, 2 weeks after 9/11, that there were surviving hijackers. So, and that's on the BBC website, it's still there. The hijackers actually survived the crashes. How would that be possible? Well, they weren't involved. That's how.
Yeah. And some of them are actual commercial pilots, right?
I don't know if any of the alleged pilots have survived. But actually, no, you're right. Yes, they are right. You're right, Ryan. That's right. Yes, some of the Arabian guys are. Yes. That's true. So I realised that although what Dr. Judy Wood and Dr. Morgan Reynolds was saying sounded utterly unbelievable, it actually explained pretty much everything in the evidence, and that's why they were going by what the evidence said. Yeah, so we've covered some of this already. The dust, the paper survived, of course. That all survived. Blowing around the streets. That dust was about an inch deep. Very unusual, the dust. I've talked about that picture already. That picture I've already talked about with the ambulance there. And that one, we've covered that one. So then we get to things like this, and this was the other thing a lot of the people in the truth movement did not want to talk about. The cars. These were pictures that were, again, shown by Dr. Judy Wood, so-called toasted cars.
Yep.
Now, the toasted cars, of course, she just said to us, it means history. You know, toast, of course, implies heat as well. And indeed, if you look at these pictures, particularly the car on the left, it looks like it's been burned. Has it really been burned when we've got an inflated tyre on the back and we've got a brand new paint job? I don't know if I've got to zoom in. I think it's maybe on the next slide. We've got this paint job in the back, which the paint is not damaged. Look at this here as well. A lot of these cars had the trunks popped open, and we see the rear lights are intact. We've got plastic lights on top here, which are intact. Polycarbonate, I think, rather than plastic. I think they are. So what's causing this damage? And people then said, well, oh, Andrew, you know, don't just forget about it, because what happened is those police cars, they were outside the World Trade Center, yeah? And then the buildings came down, they were in flames, the flames went onto the cars started burning, and then they towed them to FDR Drive, which is about a quarter of a mile away, which is where this car is in the picture, Franklin D. Roosevelt Drive in Manhattan. I think I've driven along there, actually. So, Andrew, just forget about it. They were towed. Dr. Judy Wood doesn't know what she's talking about, you know. So just forget about it and stop bringing the truth movement into disrepute. And then Dr. Judy Wood had collected pictures like this. This was the so-called toasted parking lot, which was again about a quarter of a mile from the World Trade Center. And this is all laid out in her book, Where Did the Towers Go? It's all in there. It's in the BEM presentation. You can find where this was. She's got maps and everything. This is now being built on. I think they've got buildings here now, so this is no longer a car park or a parking lot. And then we've got this picture. And so what I did was I took out the relevant pieces of these two pictures and made this picture here. And I made an animated GIF. And if you look carefully here, you can see that there are two cars here. I've highlighted them with the captions. That are okay. We've got a red car and a black car. They're okay. And then right next to them, less than 10 feet away, incredible rust. And you can see that several places in this image where we've got cars which are completely destroyed right next to cars which are pretty much no damage. How can this be? How can this be? The 9/11 Truth Movement does not want to talk about this. There are about 5 people that talk about this: myself, Dr. Judy Wood, Dr. Morgan Reynolds, Richard D. Hall, a chap called Christian Hampson, who runs a channel called Wolf Clan Media. They've done videos on this stuff. Nobody else wants to talk about it. This is the most extraordinary thing that you can think of, really, in terms of what happened on 9/11. So Dr. Judy Wood, as you mentioned, she's an expert in materials engineering science. And what she considered was happening here was a phenomenon called interference, constructive and destructive interference. If you look up an experiment in physics called the Young slit experiment, this is where you get two laser beam. You get a laser beam, you split the beam, and then you arrange it such that you make that beam impact on a target, such that the one part of the beam is has a path which is one wavelength of light longer than the other one, and then you can get these what are called interference bars, and you can use this to as a way. I won't go into how you do it, but as a form of it's all called optical interferometry. And this is what the technique that Dr. Judy Wood was using in her research, because you can use it to measure stress in materials. And I'd seen this, I'd seen the way that this was done many years ago in a demonstration, so I knew that what she was saying was, you know, spot on. So there were regions of destruction and regions where there was no destruction. And then she catalogued all these other effects, like, for example, where's the engine block gone in this fire truck? And what is that happened with this tire, which is partly disintegrated? What about this truck here? It's got more damage on the inside than the outside. What's going on there? And again here, all the inside, the outside is in pretty good shape, but something very strange has been going on the inside, and the warping of the metal. And this one is another one. This was taken around about the 13th of September. Back of the truck is fine. But the front is incredibly rusted. It looks like it's been at the bottom of the ocean for 3 years. Yet this was before the cleanup had even really got seriously started. What's going on? As we later found out, what's going on is atomic changes in the materials, or molecular changes. The material here has been affected at a molecular or a nuclear level, and that's why, in summary, they put out the nuclear bomb story, because that's meant to explain some of these nuclear effects. But it wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a nuclear bomb. And it wasn't a dirty bomb. It wasn't that at all. This gives us another clue to what it actually was, because we don't know exactly what it was, but we know the class of technology, because this class of technology actually has history, and we know somebody that has been involved with that technology, and which we'll get to shortly. But you can see here we have evidence of cars which have been inverted. You can see an NYPD car has been inverted, a private car has been inverted, a fire truck's been inverted, and I've got a video clip as well of somebody going to an inverted car. How is this possible? How is this possible? It's not possible. Oh, Andrew, no, it is possible. You know, you're making this up, Andrew, because what happened was, a big wind came down when the towers were destroyed, when they were collapsing, and it blew across the field, and that's what the wind blew the cars upside down. Did it? Seriously? Really? And then you get things like this. So we have a double glazed unit here with only one pane broken. So this wasn't caused by a projectile going through that pane. That pane being destroyed was not caused by a projectile going through it or some debris. No way, Jose. Doesn't explain the evidence. It was something else, and there are a number of examples of this. So Dr. Judy Wood was noticing all these things and more. She was noticing all these things. Something very unusual happened. She noticed these pictures as well from, I think these were like 3 or 4 weeks after. Why has somebody put landfill soil on top of the World Trade Center debris? You can see like rubbish here, look, with soil with plastic bottles in, dumped on top of the material which used to make up the towers. Why? Well, we think there was a nuclear process which was ongoing, and this was put on the site to try and dampen that down or soak it up, whatever was going on. You can see it again more clearly here. We've got like debris here, bits of rubbish dumped on top of the truck. What the hell is going on? And Dr. Judy Wood was noticing all of this.
When would they have done this? Right after the collapse?
This was probably like in the first 3 weeks, something like that. But I don't know the exact dates. I think some of that information maybe in Dr. Wood's book. I don't have the exact dates in my mind, but we're talking like within the first sort of couple of months, I think, of the destruction. And they were hosing the place down. And in fact, when I went there in 2008, they were still hosing the place down. I think I've got that later. Okay. So anyway, what Dr. Wood started talking about, I think, in 2006, 2007, was that she said she had seen evidence of energy effects. There was some type of energy was used. So she said it was directed energy that had been used. Now, when she said this, she didn't even know that directed energy weapons existed. That wasn't her field of expertise, interest, or research. She didn't know, for example, about the Airborne Laser Project or the Teil project, which are these military projects where they've actually developed high energy lasers and so forth. She didn't know about the Directed Energy Professional Society, which anybody can go look at. You can join their group if you want, and look at their presentations, and you can buy their lethality handbook, which I've got a copy of somewhere. So she began to realize, or had realized, that it was the only thing that could explain this was some way that energy had been used. And she then started to realize that some of the people that were involved in the production of the World Trade Center technical reports, which was the NIST report, the so-called NIST report. I don't know if I've got, I haven't got that here. Yeah, so let me talk about the NIST reports here. So in 2003, we had the so-called 9/11 Commission report, which was, it took them 18 months to get going on that. And that was described as a 571-page lie. That talked about the failure of intelligence services and the military and all blah, 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 and all that nonsense. But in 2005, NIST produced 10,000 pages of technical documents about the destruction of the World Trade Center. It's called Why Did the World Trade Center Buildings Collapse? And what you can go and find if you look at the relevant information is that they used 23 contractors to produce those 10,000 pages of reports. Two of those contractors are shown on this slide, a company called Applied Research Associates, another company called Science Applications International Corporation, which is, we'll be coming back to that later. They were involved in coordinating the production of the reports. But what was not immediately obvious, unless you go and look at this company, it's a very, very strange company. And it's involved, in fact, I think it's the biggest military contractor in the USA. It's won the most money or the most number of military contracts of any company, Science Applications International Corporation. They were helping to produce the World Trade Center reports, as were Applied Research Associates, as I said. Both of those companies do research into or they're manufacturers of directed energy weapons systems or components. Science Applications International Corporation, one of their other areas of expertise, is running psychological operations, which is what they did in Iraq in 2003, I think, yes, which is on their website. Boeing was involved in the production of the reports. They weren't a contractor, but they supplied information, and they were one of the manufacturers which were involved in the Airborne Laser Project. So this all became fairly clear that they would have an interest in not talking about directed energy being involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center. So there was that. So let's see where else I want to go from there. Yeah. So in 2007, from the advice of Jerry Leapart, who was Dr. Wood's attorney at that time, they wrote to the Kirtland Air Force Base. At Kirtland Air Force Base, they have a directed energy directorate, and they were asked, can you explain these energy effects that we've seen in the World Trade Center evidence from the destruction? That was essentially the question that they were sent. And Rich Garcia responded, you report phenomena that we cannot explain either because we don't have enough data or because the phenomena are not within our area of expertise. So this chap from Kirtland Air Force Base didn't say, no, 9/11 was done by Al-Qaeda. He didn't say that. He admitted that they couldn't explain what Dr. Judy Wood had sent to them. So, make of that what you will. That's what happened. And so there was that one. Yeah, so Dr. Wood, what she did was, along with Morgan Reynolds, they submitted a request for correction. So they did make legal efforts, and in fact, really, they're the only people that have tried to do this in the 21 years since 9/11. There have been legal cases brought in relation. There was the Ellen Mariani case, and there was another case I think brought by another fellow who stayed at my house called William Rodriguez. He brought a case, but I think that was a sham case. The Dr. Wood, what they did was they got this information, some of the pictures that I've shown you and many more. They said to NIST, look, your World Trade Center reports are wrong. The physics you describe is, doesn't work. It's incorrect. Here's why it's incorrect. You need to correct your report, please, under the Data Quality Act in the US. And they basically refused. So they refused to correct the report. They refused to talk about the evidence that Dr. Judy Wood had pointed out to them, which was publicly available. And so she took them to court. She took the contractors to court in a key time case. And that was done between 2007 and 2009. The 9/11 Truth Movement covered this up. They didn't want to talk about it. There's a whole story I've got behind that from what reaction I got in the UK. They wouldn't talk about it. Stephen E. Jones, for example, with his thermite evidence, he never submitted that to a court. They did submit a court document after Dr. Wood's, but they didn't mention thermite, which was their main evidence, according to them. So in 2008, the judge dismissed the Wood and Reynolds cases. And in the ruling, they mentioned the moon landings and JFK, which of course have nothing to do with the destruction of the World Trade Center and the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. An appeal was dismissed in 2009, and then there's a story behind that as well, which I don't have time to go into. And then the Supreme Court just didn't hear the case. They just ignored it, as did most of the rest of the world. So the point behind, of course, me explaining that is Wood and Reynolds, they knew that what they were saying was true, and that's why they attempted to take it to court. And within that court document set was an affidavit by somebody called John Hutchison. So this now takes us back to what happened to the towers and what the technology was that was used. Now we contend that based on the evidence, that what the technology was that was used to destroy the World Trade Center operated on principles similar to what is known in the sort of alternative world as the Hutchison effect. So John Hutchison, he's an experimental physicist. He doesn't have any advanced degrees. He's one of these inventors and tinkerers. He's very good at what he does. And since 1979, he was doing experiments with electrostatic and magnetic fields. There are books written about him. George Hathaway's written a book about him. Many videos you can find online. He's still on Facebook. He's still around. I've communicated with him many times. And in certain combinations and at certain times, John has produced jellification of metal, bending and fracturing of metal, lift, levitation and disintegration, transmutation, that's a key one metal changing into another metal, fuming, not necessarily smoke, things disappearing into thin air, and fusing of dissimilar materials. And he did have, one time, 500 pounds of metal samples from his experiments, okay, which he sold on eBay. I know people that have bought samples of this on eBay. So this was an experiment he did. Actually, I got the date wrong on this. Is 2006. He did this experiment where he was using microwave energy and he was using a magnetic field, an electrostatic field in his lab that he had at the time. And he's got this boat here. It's a model boat. He's meant to be trying to reproduce the Philadelphia experiment. You can read up on that separately if you want to, where they allegedly tried to make this ship disappear in the 1943, I think it was, USS Eldridge. So you can see what's happening is he's beaming this with microwaves, with electricity. I'm not sure of the exact way he does it. But then after this, he gets these fires breaking out on the edge of the hull. And on 9/11, we had these weird car fires, which were witnessed, but next to them, paper which wasn't burning. So Dr. Judy Wood has called these weird fires, and she's highlighted these in her book, many instances where you'd think this paper should be burning. We see a firefighter here who's walking right through it as if the fire is of no concern to him or not going to cause him any injury. So you can see the fire going around the hull of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
About. And then we get onto a copper 3-inch diameter copper bar on the left, which was created by John Hutchison using his experimental setup, and that's a beam from the World Trade Center destruction held by WJE. And then we have another of John's samples on the left here, an aluminium bar, and then a deformed piece of metal from the World Trade Center destruction. And then, of course, I've shown you the levitated cars. John can levitate a cannonball. He did that in an experiment in 1990s, and also he's done this levitation experiment with a can as well, with a Red Bull can. People have tried to say that this is an upside down video, so what's happening is they claim that John is moving a magnet at the bottom of the screen, but it's actually the top, and then he releases the magnet and it drops. No, that's not what he's doing. He's creating a levitation effect. Mm-hmm. John has been studied by the Canadian government. He's had contacts in the Pentagon that have looked at his research. He's been to Japan. He's been on many TV documentaries demonstrating his work and his research. The guy is for real, folks. There's an aftermath of the Red Bull experiment where the energy has been used to disrupt the metal, and there's one of the hazmat trucks from the World Trade Center destruction. So I've also got, for example, a witness testimony of Michael Mako. I realized I couldn't get out from under the collapse. I dove under an ESU truck that was facing north on the west side of West Street. I dove under that, waited for the building to come down. When the building did come down, I actually thought I was trapped, and the truck was blown off me, pushed off me, I guess. It was not there. At that point, I was just really, really shocked. Didn't know what was going on at that point. I didn't know. I was really shocked. And Rennie Davila, while we're walking, I realize that we only have 2 people. I see my vehicle. The seats are covered. I've still got my bag. I hold it like a trophy, like people collect basketballs. I haven't touched whatever the force was. It was so strong that it went inside my bag. What's this force he's talking about? Mm-hmm. I put it to you that it's a force which was actually created by the interaction of different forms of energy, which is exactly what John Hutchison was doing. We also have another bit of that testimony. If you go and read that file, which I think is still publicly available, you'll find another bit of that testimony where Rennie Davila is talking about his fire truck blew up. He said that the sucker blew up. He actually talks about that. The other thing that was happening around the same time is the so-called Scott packs, which are the air tanks which were carried on the backs of the fire trucks, were spontaneously exploding. So people say bombs in the building, folks, because the explosions, everything that explodes isn't a bomb. So bombs could go boom, but not everything that goes boom is a bomb. Mm-hmm. If you get a fire extinguisher and somehow the metal walls of that fire extinguisher are weakened to the point where the structure is compromised, it will explode. It will explode. So the explosive sounds, we argue, were due to pressurized tanks within the World Trade Center towers exploding as the metal was basically turning to jelly or turning to dust, or at the beginnings of that process as it happened. And this was happening on the fire trucks as well. So we know that it was essentially a field effect, which is what we're going to eventually come on to. So let's just go to the slides again, see where I want to go next. Oh yeah, so this is another important one. So this is a stainless steel bar on the left where this has changed to rust and you get bits of copper appearing, zinc. These have been taken to a lab and tested for the elements that have appeared, and new elements have been formed in these samples that shouldn't be there. That's been tested by the Max Planck Institute in Germany and other places as well. We've seen this happening. So we know that this is going on. The nuclear process, which we think was initiated by this technology, as I said, it does not stop straight away. And we think this is why they were hosing down the site meticulously And this was going on in January 2008. That's when I visited the site with Dr. Judy Wood. We went to Manhattan then and did a bit of a recce back then. Yeah, and I took a little video. I won't play the video now. And the other thing which talks to this idea of the process being ongoing was what happened to the Deutsche Bank, or the Bankers Trust building. It was damaged during the destruction of the World Trade Center. It was just across the street, as you saw in the original photo I showed. And you can see here that this so-called chunk of wheat checks, as Dr. Wood calls them, a chunk of girders, somehow had become detached. It hadn't turned to dust. It had, however, crashed into the Bankers Trust building and bent. You can see that if you look closely at this picture, this is bent outwards. This about halfway down, it's actually bent outwards. How can something bounce into the building and then bend it outwards? And there's more. If you look at this picture, this was from the FEMA report, which I think was published in 2002. The FEMA report said there was no fire in the Deutsche Bank building. And indeed, that is true, because you can see on the right here, there's a telephone cable. You can see the coil of the insulation on the telephone cable. There it is. Inches away from that, maybe 5 feet, no, probably inches, there is a melted steel girder with holes in it. So something very strange was happening to the Bankers Trust building, in which there was no fire and was not hit by anything. So what happened is they actually took out all those damaged sections, and then by July 2006, Bankers Trust building had mostly been repaired. Then it was declared to have a mold infection, and they took the Bankers Trust building apart piece by piece. A company that did that was called John Galt. They'd never demolished a building before, and they took it apart at a cost of $70 million. Now, we would argue that this was because it got this some sort of infection, or call it what you will, a material infection, and it had started to rust. So you can see the central girder here is very badly rusted, much more than the other ones around it. So that building is now disappeared. They took it down, and I think they finished taking it down. I think when we got there in 2008, it was about, I think, 2/3 down or 3/4 down, but there's something else now there. Anyway, so we started to talk about this in 2007, 2008. I went on this show with Dr. Judy Wood, Ambrose Lane, who's now no longer with us. Ambrose Lane was a human rights and civil rights activist. I believe he knew Martin Luther King, so he was a well-known figure in Washington, D.C., I understand. So what else do I want to include? I think maybe, let's just see if I can go back to my slides, because before I go on to the other bit, I want to go back, I think. Do I?